Michelle.
You, Sterling and Barry. Good morning. The title of my speech is What Will My Legacy Be? Thinking back on my childhood, I can reflect on growing up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and living with my parents. There are many stories that I can share relating to some of the most memorable times in my life and about my family. My mother, who I would describe as an angel, was very loving and kind, and my dad was just the opposite. He was very abusive. Unfortunately, I experienced the loss of my parents when I was 7 years of age because of a tragedy. It was a great loss, and because my brothers and I were so young, we really didn't understand what was happening around us. After losing my parents, my two brothers and I made the transition of living with my grandparents. Before losing my parents, my grandmother, who was very nurturing, cared for us after school while both parents worked. Eventually, my grandparents became our legal guardians and raised us until we were old enough to leave home. What I can tell you about my grandmother was that she was very nurturing and loving and caring. My grandmother, whose mother was a full-blooded Indian, and her father was Caucasian. On the other hand, what I remember my grandfather, based on some of the stories that we were later told, was that his mother was a slave who, even after being emancipated, remained on the plantation because she believed it would be easier for her to stay because that was the only life she knew. My grandfather never mentioned anything about his father. My grandfather, who was not a slave, refused to stay on the plantation, therefore leaving his mother at the age of 15 and migrating to the north on the railroad so that he could have a better life. As a child, I remember going on vacation to Florida and visiting my aunt for the summer. I loved traveling to Miami, Florida. The weather was always beautiful and sunny. What I remember most was seeing the coconut and palm trees, going to the beach, and admiring the scenic view. During the summer months, I not only got a chance to visit Miami, but the beaches of New Jersey when vacationing with my grandparents. Growing up, on the weekends, I would wake up to the sound of classical, gospel, or contemporary music being played in my home. My aunt loved to play the piano. My aunt, who had lived at home, had never married and was a classically trained and gifted pianist who was privileged to have sung at Carnegie Hall. The community that my grandparents lived at once upon a time, was thriving with a lot of Black-owned businesses. My uncle Dennis had an office and lived a couple doors from our house. Every business in the neighborhood, whether it was a corner store, deli, funeral home, real estate office, was mostly Black-owned. And no, this was not Tulsa, Oklahoma. There was a lot of diversity in my neighborhood because there were other business owners from other nationalities and cultures. Eventually, the neighborhood changed and the people that were more established moved to the suburbs, which caused the neighborhood to decline. My grandparents, although very enterprising, were very humble people. They were respected and well-known in the community. My family was considered bourgeoisie Black people. This was a term used after slavery to describe self-made Black people who moved to the North where they were treated better and were able to buy homes and accumulate wealth. My family were not materialistic people and remained in their community long after the businesses that once thrived had moved away. Their mission was to stay and give back and help the people in their community. I would often wonder why the neighbors would come over to our home. They would come and borrow money from our family who never charged interest. My aunt on my father's side recently had a conversation with me. She told me when my grandparents died, it was the talk of the community. They were considered pillars of the community and were loving, compassionate, and kind to everyone and well respected. She mentioned that while visiting the bank teller, they had mentioned that my grandmother had passed away, and they were talking about our good family name and how they were shocked that a Black family that was so financially established had remained in the community. In Proverbs 22:1, it says that a good name is chosen over great wealth and that favor is better than silver and gold. I often wonder what my legacy will be when I'm no longer here. Will my legacy be one worth remembering? Will I be able to measure up to the legacy of my grandparents? Will I be forgotten? Their legacy is still alive, yet they are no longer with us. What will my legacy be? I would hope that my legacy gives honor not only to my grandparents, but to my children. What will my legacy be is a question that I propose to you, my audience. Do you know what your legacy will be when you're no longer living? That is a good question. I can't answer that question, but I hope it is one that will last throughout generation to generation, just like my grandparents, because their legacy continues to live through me and three generations after. Thanks you, excuse me. Thanks for allowing me to share some of my family history with you in this story.